Welcome, everybody. I'm Rachael, Jarosh, President and CEO of Enactus, and I am delighted to welcome you to this Lead Change session on equality, where we are and where we're heading as a global community. Issues of equality and equity are complex and arise in every element of our lives. Not surprisingly, they are top of mind for Enactus students. In our survey last year, the majority of students surveyed ranked issues of equality, both racial and socioeconomic, among their top concerns. We're going to dive into this topic with some leading voices creating more inclusive workplaces and communities, and I am incredibly honored to welcome our friends today. First, I'm thrilled to welcome Nishamu Dlamu, Global Head of People for KPMG. Ronald Reeves, Head and Diversity and Inclusion for the Americas of AIG, and special guest Latanya Mapp Frett, President and CEO of the Global Fund for Women, and Ambreen, one of our Enactus correspondents. So thank you all for joining us today. I'm incredibly honored. Thank you for being here. I want to start this very complex discussion, with a personal question, because each of you plays an incredibly vital role in creating more inclusive workplaces and communities. So let's start with Nishamu. What led you to the role you have today?
Thank you, Rachael. What led me is a long story, but I'm going to summarize why I'm doing what I'm doing. I think for me, what has always been important is to bring humanity and dignity into the workplace. So whilst my background professionally has been in management consulting, where I was working with people and change and organizational transformations, doing that internally gives me an opportunity to bring what I've learned to the fore in terms of how we manage our own people and how we contribute positively to society and to individual lives through careers. So this is why I do what I do.
So thank you for that, because we speak often about the many students who find their sense of purpose through their work at Enactus, and it sounds as though that is what has led and guided your endeavor. Ronald, what about you? Share a little bit about how you've landed in the role that you have and what led you there.
Rachael, I've always had the opportunity to be engaged with diversity and inclusion from my first job at Cornell University, where I was not only an associate director of the student union, but they actively sent me out on recruiting trips to recruit diverse talent to Ithaca, New York. That was followed by a role at Allstate Insurance Company, where when I was hired in, they said, we want you to hire or help us to recruit more Black, Latinx talent. And when I think that was over 20 years ago that Allstate had that vision. And then, of course, my time at AIG. I've had a variety of roles, be it learning and development, diversity and inclusion, but I've always been passionate about how do we embed diversity, inclusion, equality into our learning curriculums, our executive development curriculums, and now I get the opportunity to drive strategies around what our workforce looks like, how to make our workplace more belonging, and how do we show up in the marketplace in terms of our brand.
It's a remarkable pathway and a great example for the students of the many ways in which we build on our careers at each step of the journey. Latanya, let me turn to you, because you too bring a remarkable and rich history, particularly in the area of human rights and women's rights. So let me ask you the same question.
Sure. Thank you, Rachael, and thank you for having us. And hello, everyone. It's been great to think about what long ago it seems like got me started. But, social justice was easy for me. I came from a long line of family members who stood up and spoke out. And so it was natural. When I got to college, one of the first things I worked on, one of the first protests was apartheid and in opposing apartheid and divesting from South Africa for the university that I attended. And that led really to one of my first internships with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. That's the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People here in the US, where I got to work on things like the right to vote, you know, which seems so simple and easy, but always there's been this resistance that, you know, I felt needed and required that we stand up against it. And so that was the journey that I started with. And so from there, it just took on a very natural tendency to work for organizations and with other individuals who have been trying and targeting social justice. And really what started me, you know, with the gender and gender equality was the fourth Beijing conference. And I can talk a little bit about that later.
Well, that's a wonderful, wonderful description of a long and interesting path, especially something that ignited for you as a younger person, much like many of our students are experiencing right now. So let's reference that Beijing conference. So you attended the World Conference on Women in Beijing in 1995, a time, frankly, when a lot of our audience wasn't yet born. I remember that conference as an observer from afar. But tell me what progress you think we've seen in human rights since then, and maybe areas where you're most hopeful.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I mean, that conference was so huge. Having 17,000 official women is what they call it. So that's from government, NGOs, the UN, attend that conference in China. Along with, and a lot of people don't talk about this, it was 30,000 grassroots women who were there. And I was one of the grassroots women. So I got to experience it from two sides. One of my biggest memories was waking up in the morning and maybe about 15,000 women together doing yoga. It was my first time doing yoga and my first time actually experiencing spirituality in a group like that size. And it was just an amazing opportunity to come together with women. Of course, everyone remembers Hillary Clinton's statement that this is once and for all women's rights or human rights. And so being able to capture that moment was really important. And, that was 25 years ago. And quite frankly, we have made a lot of progress. Our representation in legislative seats have increased by roughly 25%. Education, of course, we're trying and have met a great degree of education for girls. And it's increased by, maybe 30 million girls in school. That's primary, middle, and high school. Women's health, maternal mortality has fallen by about 38%. So we do have a lot to celebrate since the Beijing conference. But of course, we still have work to do. We have a lot of work to do. Roughly 75 countries still deny women the right to own property. And that's something that as you look at economic opportunity, starting businesses, this is a major problem. Structurally, women are still vastly underrepresented in formal economic sectors around the world. Culturally, women still shoulder the burden, 75% of the burden of unpaid caregiving and housework. And so, my friend Ellen Chesler wrote up a really great article about how far we've come, but let us not forget how far we have to go. And so there has been movement. But what makes me hopeful really is that the change, the activists, what we're seeing out here from the Green Wave movement to Black Lives Matter, women, people, communities are standing up, particularly towards equality. And thinking about how we come together in ways that have impact for all of us, whatever community we come from. And so I'm seeing this, definitely the feminist movement is standing up together with others. Research is showing that social justice is the thing that causes lasting, sustainable change. And so we know that we're moving in the right direction when we talk about equality, when we talk about diversity, inclusion. These things are proven to be able to work to create lasting change, lasting social change, whether it's political, economic, or cultural. I went to Peace Corps. I was a Peace Corps volunteer, and so many of you may know about the U.S. Peace Corps. And it just made me so incredibly hopeful for young people to work together with others in community and be able to seek equality in the communities. And so what's great about that thread is really starting at home with your community and seeing how that blossoms into world affairs, into global programs, as Global Fund for Women does. And we continue to work at Global Fund for Women with organizations, with universities who lift up leadership, particularly for women in other marginalized communities. And we know that we have to do that. We have to continue to do that, as all of you are, in order for us to ensure that we have a society that's equal and just.
Thank you for that. There's a lot to unpack there, and I know much of what you shared resonates with many of our students. We have a large, I will say the majority of our students worldwide are actually young women, very focused, as all of our students are, on many of the issues that remain for us to tackle as a global community. I want to turn the conversation just a minute, building on what you've just said about recent events. Obviously, the pandemic, its unequal economic impact, its economic reverberations, and certainly events in my home city of Minneapolis, across the US and the world, have given rise to global voices speaking out against systemic racism, demanding change, creating new pathways. And so, Ronald, I'd like to talk with you a little bit about the private sector, because you talked about a long career in diversity and inclusion. One of the things that is top of mind for our students, and it is a huge privilege and one of my honors to work with students who often are focused not only on the impact of their work, but on their role as leaders creating inclusive environments. One of the first things that students were asking us when the pandemic hit and they were suddenly forced home off their campuses and working to continue their work in community, one of the most frequent questions I heard was, how do I support my teammates, and how do I create and ensure I'm strengthening an inclusive team? Critical to all of our success, economically, spiritually, physically. Ronald, what would you share about the private sector in advancing progress on inclusivity?
I believe the private sector plays a major role. If you think about it, we control a lot of wealth. We drive a lot of wealth and career opportunities. I'm excited and hopeful that, several corporations, including my own, have stood up and made bold declarations around how they want to implement change. But I'm also cautiously optimistic. I'm hoping that we won't just talk, but we will also do. We're encouraging leaders in our organization that this is a time to really listen to those who have been marginalized, those who are underrepresented, and go into those conversations to deepen your understanding, not to respond, not to defend, but to really understand better about the experiences that some of the underrepresented populations in our organization have been experiencing. And then we've been challenging them to learn. How do you continue your own education and awareness? Because what I'm hearing from our executives, Ronald, I learned a lot in that conversation with you when I asked you, how are you doing? What's making you feel the way you feel? What do you need going forward? And what are you hoping for? And how can I stand with you as an ally? And now what we're asking our organization is, how do we turn that listening into actions? And I'm encouraging those that are listening, how do we make those measurable actions? Because that's what a lot of my colleagues are looking for. We've been talking, but what will the measurable actions look like? What will the change look like? And for that, my advice for all people managers is, how do we be intentional about inclusion and become curious? Who is being included? Who's not being included? And ask that question, why? I know that there's a large request for data, but my response has really been consistent. We need to open our eyes. We can see who is being included. We can see who's not being included. We're all very unique. And so when I look at this screen, and as we look around the rooms, who are the people, who are the shades that are missing? Who are the voices that don't have a seat at this table? And how do we bring about that particular change? And I'm challenging the private sector that, you know, how can we really drive this change and be seen as thought leaders?
Shamo, I'd ask you the same question. I know running a global organization in terms of global talent, these issues are top of mind for you as well.
They definitely are top of mind. And before I talk about what we've been doing, I just need to respond to something that Latanya mentioned. She mentioned apartheid and that being your first experience with inequality. I come from South Africa, and what I didn't mention, because we're also talking about female issues, is that I was the CEO of KPMG in South Africa for a short period of time. So you took me back there with some of the comments that you were making. And Ronald, the points that you raise about the question that Rachael is asking about what business can do, I won't repeat because I agree with more, but I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've been doing inside the firm in order to deal with specifically anti-Black racism, but the actions that we've taken also recognize that we also need to deal with other forms of discrimination, and we're learning through that experience to do so. So what we decided to do is, in order to listen even better for a global firm, is to run a 72-hour collaborative listening session that we termed the Courageous Conversation. We had at least 12,500 of our people joining and commenting for a long time on what they wanted to see. Our objectives were threefold. The first one was that we wanted to actually elevate and hear the voices of our Black colleagues and give them space to share their stories and experiences. The second thing that we explicitly said we wanted to do is to challenge ourselves and challenge our own systems and practices and actually look at where we need to be taking action. The third one that was quite explicit, and we asked for actions, was to crowdsource ideas of how we actually need to react in order to fix what is actually a historical inequality over the years. What is it that we can do? We recognize that we won't fix everything all at once. However, we've committed to building momentum behind those actions. So we're currently sifting through the actions, and there were many, as you can imagine, being on a platform for 3 days with people from across 117 countries commenting on the subject matter. So we have listened. And the first thing that we had done is a commitment from our global chairman that we're going to listen so that we can act in a meaningful way. The actions that we're looking at are not necessarily just actions that we can take as a business internally, but we're also looking at what are the other actions that we can take. I mean, a good example, and actually just talking to the audience here, is that we are a big employer of young people. A lot of people join KPMG as their first job. So we employ tens of thousands of people on an annual basis. We therefore take our responsibility of nurturing those careers seriously. And part of what needs to happen is what Ronald was referring to with recruiting talent as diverse as possible from diverse sources. And that's one of the reasons why it is absolutely important for us to actually go beyond having listened in this intensive way in order to act. It was not an easy process because it's difficult to listen to some of the stories and actually to hear the pain and actually work with it and be able to go beyond that to identify what needs to be done and actions that need to be taken. And I think it's an important phase that we're in, which is like identifying what we're going to do and committing to very specific actions from the ground up.
Thank you for sharing that. What a remarkable and courageous undertaking. Like you, I share the understanding that can be very difficult, not just to have the courage to share those experiences, but also to truly hear them, to hear that pain and to respond, to bring people together to respond, I should say. effectively. And Ronald, I saw you nodding during her comments. Would you like to add on to that? It sounds like this may resonate for you and your colleagues at AIG as well.
I mean, the actions that were being outlined were definitely inspiring. When you think of crowdsourcing, you know, some of my advice to some of the executives within AIG is you don't have to come up with all of the answers on your own. I said a lot of that power is in that group, and that same group that shared their pain and shared their experiences, they have some ideas around solutions that can change. Our employee resource groups have been very invaluable in this process. They've been leading these courageous conversations and have been very willing to lean in. And so I'm encouraging other corporations to think about how do you engage, whether you call them affinity groups, business resource groups, employee resource groups. They are willing and want to help us to drive the change that we want to see.
So that's an interesting perspective for students who are thinking about the future of work. You know, as you know, our Enactus students today in many parts of the world are working on these issues in their own community. And one of the most compelling parts of that process, of course, is learning from the communities with whom they work and from the individuals in those communities who often have solutions at the fore that students can support and scale. Let me ask a little bit about how students might think about bringing their voice to that table in the workplace. This is a question I often receive from students. I suspect we'll get some questions today in the course of our conversation that echo it, which is, as I enter the workplace, how do I effectively share my experience in a way that contributes to the workplace without putting, frankly, myself at risk? What counsel would you give our students as they think about bringing their whole selves to their career path? Maybe I'll start with you, Ronald.
I would pick up on where I left off. I would encourage the new hires to think about joining one of the employee resource groups. All of the employee resource groups at AIG have allies in their title because they want to not only, if you're a part of that dimension of diversity, but we feel that the allies have a very large voice, and it's a way to educate yourself and create more awareness. At our organization, we have over 150 employee resource groups in 40 different countries, and we're even encouraging cross-border partnerships. This pandemic has allowed us, because we're all at home, to be able to attend each other's events and to be able to engage one another in a way that we weren't able to do previously. And at AIG, I can say that our employee resource groups have a tremendous voice. We see them as influential leaders. We see them as innovators. We see them as what we would call culture carriers. And what we have seen is that is a way for employees to have their voice heard immediately. They have helped us to recruit diverse talent and underrepresented talent. They have helped us to add new benefits. We have a surrogacy and an adoption benefit because of our LGBTQ+ and allies, ERGs. And so if you're looking for advocacy, you're looking for innovation, you're looking for extending some of the work that you're doing with Enactus, we encourage our employee resource groups to work and coach and judge Enactus competitions. It's just an extension of what you're doing today.
Well, we're very grateful for that, of course. So thank you. And just Shalama, I would turn the same question to you, because I know this is a very practical and pragmatic question, and our students are often both of those things. I certainly felt pressured in a very different time as a young woman, as the first lawyer in my first job at my law firm, to be very careful about how I express my opinions and views. What do you counsel your younger workforce and those who are seeking to join the KPMG organization? How do you counsel students on this critical topic?
So I agree with Ronald on joining employee resource groups. And I would say that go beyond that and recognize the moment that you're entering the workplace in. So we were talking about the recent events of George Floyd's death and what happened at the back of that with Black Lives Matter. You're entering the workplace at a time when there is a language to talk about race. And you're listening to us today talk about it in the context of business. And this is no longer something that we speak about only at the water cooler. So I would encourage people joining organizations, especially young people, to not lose their voice and not give it up too quickly. So the challenge, though, is how do you find a way of raising your voice in a way that will get you results? And so employee resource groups are helpful. However, also speak to your direct line managers. People are willing to now hear different voices and speak in confidence about your own experiences, because we need to teach each other. Ronald spoke about education. Latanya was talking about the need for advocacy and how people learn and how systems change over time. What is needed is your energy at a time that is critical, and your voice to be heard and not to be muted. And to remember that as you come into the workplace, you're also a representative of the society that you come from. And there is a responsibility that we all carry to be able to represent that appropriately within business, so that business itself can grow in its understanding of how to best engage and involve society and to involve younger people, because you've got a different view and we're looking for that viewpoint all the time.
Thank you for that. And I know that we have Ambreen Khan with us as well, and she is fielding some questions from our audience. And I know there are several leading into our chat here. So Ambreen, welcome. First of all, thank you for joining us. And I'll turn it to you for one of the questions from our audience.
Thank you, Rachel. So the first question I have from the audience is from Tianying Yu, and they ask, in the US, how do we show or demonstrate that the movement towards equality for minorities and women is also beneficial for white people and males?
Should I jump in, or?
Please do. That's a big question.
That's a big question, but actually one that we talk about quite a bit. And, I just want to go back to and reinforce what Ndlamu was saying, is that you can't have a just, fair, and inclusive workplace unless you're coming from a just, fair, and inclusive society. And so much of the work that we're doing is not just to make sure that our workplaces are fair and equitable, but it is that spillover into society. So it's the chicken and the egg, right? So it's like, which one comes first? And when we talk about looking at issues around whether it's whether it's race, it's gender, it's sexuality, those things are issues that should not be something that you have to worry about when you come into, whether it's settings in society, political, economic, social, cultural. And so that's what we're talking about. So when we're talking about a fair society, naturally, we're talking about a society that's fair for everyone. And so when we talk about Black Lives Matter in the US, we're not just talking about equality for Black people, but we're talking about lifting up an issue that has been underpinning so much of inequality and injustice in the country, that by lifting up the bottom, you lift up everyone. And I know that we talk about that a lot. We talk about working with the most marginalized communities is what we do at Global Fund for Women. Because if we leave them behind, we get to what we see, which is vast inequality. And so while, white males are continuing to rise in the ranks in all of those sectors, you leave behind a great deal of people if you don't include them, if you don't actually target some of them, if you don't call out their voices. It's hard, like Ronald and Ndlamu was talking about, to be vocal, to use your voice if there's no space to use that. And so when we're talking about Black Lives Matter, when we're talking about so many of the other movements, Me Too and others, we're talking about lifting up those who have not had a voice or an adequate voice to be able to encourage a society that's fair, just, and equitable in the workplace, outside the workplace, in the family, in the home. So all of those things are good for everyone, not just, a particular set of people, but all in society, including white males.
Ambreen?
What I would add is that
Oh, please, Ronald.
Go ahead, Ronald.
I'm sorry. I often ask a provocative question. I'm like, why wouldn't we want equality in the workplace? And, we spoke just before about advocacy and having a voice. And I'm encouraging my white colleagues to engage. I said, because you have a lot of seats at the tables where you can make the change. I'm like, a lot of us are not at that table and don't have that privilege of being able to influence the pay and the promotions and who gets hired into the organization. And so we're asking you to become a partner in this and to become an ally in this. And then I become curious for those that don't want to engage and those who don't want to be an ally. I begin to ask why. Help me understand why you don't want more women to be considered for these roles, or more Black or Latinx or Asian or differently abled talent, because it tells me a lot about the individual, and what I'm looking at are actions as opposed to just words.
Thank you, Ronald. I want to recognize and appreciate that we have 3 incredible and inspiring Black leaders. And I really do hope that, hearing the changes and, the education around what you are all doing in your own respective companies and organizations, I really hope this is not a fleeting moment for those organizations and companies who don't have people of color in leadership. And I hope that we see systemic changes in those organizations as well. I do want to switch over to another student question that has just come in. This individual is N. Elbias, who asks that the new approaches and strategies for education are necessary to ensure equality in education. Now, what do those new approaches and strategies look like?
I'll jump in again too, because I've been thinking a lot lately at Global Fund for Women about the tech sector. And we've seen data that says that the number of women majoring in computer science dropped in the 80s from 37% to 18% in 2013, 14, whenever we had the last data there. And so that's very concerning, because it also is a sector that's growing generally in the economic side. And so not having as many women, and, and I think it does go back to what our colleagues were talking about as far as being included, feeling like you're actually being sought after to be in that space. And how do we look at that differently? And so for a great deal of us, who work in the gender space, we of course see the need to increase representation of girls in tech and leadership more broadly. And the work that we want to do at Global Fund for Women really is starting with adolescent girls and encouraging them towards careers that they want. So there's about this age right before high school where girls start looking differently at the work world, at economics, and they start trying to fill their space and their place and to increase their voice. And oftentimes it is right at that point in adolescence when they're also shut down, when so many of their issues, whether it's about menstruation or so many different things, body shame, starts coming up. And so it diverts them into a space that may not have been the one that they originally were interested in. So not taking math, not speaking up in class, not doing the things that they originally were doing and excelling at in primary and middle school classes. And so we really do see, as the student asked, an opportunity to, through all of our work around social justice, to ensure that there are movements that encourage young girl leadership. And I'm so happy about the programs that we're starting to see around the world that encourages that space. I was just in Kenya, and I see that they have also an amazing amount of programs for girls and women in tech. And those are the kind of things that we need to do. We need to find out where the gaps are. We need to understand what the problems are, and we need to create and work with and support movements that change that for girls and for women. That's
Latanya, if you'd like to add on.
Yeah, I was just going to say, with KPMG's commitment to lifelong learning as well, I'd love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that and support what Latanya is saying. For me, there's also this whole concept of equity. When we think about bringing people and changing people's lives, education is one of the things that can add to that and help people get opportunities. And one of the things that we actually spend a lot of time grappling with is how do we create enough of opportunities for a diverse group of people, because we know that we perform better when we've got diverse people inside the firm, whether it be it women, be it Black people, or ethnically diverse people. So that's an important part of this. Now, if I turn it to lifelong learning, it really is important for us as an organization, not only to support people once they've joined the firm, is our interest in education goes into building a pipeline. So we have a number of programs across our different member firms where we do support school-going children, but we also support young adults through various bursary schemes. But once they enter the organization, we also focus on providing lifelong learning, various different mechanisms. And one of the things that we recognize we can do as a large multidisciplinary organization is providing broader career progression by providing different and diverse career paths. So, and that actually makes it easy for people to keep on improving and stretching themselves and stretching their goals. The challenge, of course, is how do we retain those people? So once we've brought them in, how do we break the glass ceilings that might exist? And that's a work in progress. And actually, that education aspect is really critical for us to be able to do that, because competence and credential is really important, in addition to making sure that we've got a broad, diverse team, and we've got a role to play in that, and we take that role quite seriously across the organization.
Thank you so much for sharing that. This is a very complex and engaging issue, but most of all, I think an area of great optimism for all of us, and everything that you've shared today reinforces that for me. It's not so much that we don't have simple problems, but that we have complex problems and complex answers. But most of all, perhaps more than ever at any other point in time, more people interested and focused on learning and helping to contribute to the solution. So it's a fascinating time to be alive. I remind that to our students frequently. Never a better time in the world to have been alive than today. Paul Pullman did that very well yesterday in his session as well. I want to thank you all for joining us. Much of what you shared today will help, frankly, not only shape our students' perspectives, but also ours at Enactus. We have much work to do, and we very much appreciate not only you being here today, but your leadership on these issues. I also want to send a special thanks to you, Ronald. AIG has sponsored this session. We know AIG, working with clients in business and life in 80 countries, is extraordinarily committed to supporting work on issues of racism and inequality. And to all of our audience, thank you for making time to join this session. As I said, this will help shape Enactus's future. It certainly will inform our students' future and ripple throughout their lives. So thank you for that. You know, amid this difficult funding environment, this interesting time of change through which we are all navigating, Enactus is experiencing a surge in participation among students, and that more than anything reinforces the importance of our mission today, these issues and the way in which they are woven into our work. So again, thank you very much for joining us. We are incredibly indebted to each of you around the world. We have many time zones we have navigated here in Ambreen, in particular to you. I will ask if you have any last words you would like to share before we wrap.
I just wanted to say that I'm an Enactus alumni of 4 years, and I hope that the students take their learnings and what they're doing in their projects and what they're doing around the world, and especially being able to connect with others with the World Cup. I hope you take what you learn and you bring it into these organizations, as our panelists have already mentioned. Hopefully, we're seeing these changes. It's a wonderful time, Rachael, as you mentioned, to be alive, to be able to be a part of real historic change, and it comes with students stepping up into those fields and having the courage to share their voices and help contribute to that change.
Thank you, Ambreen. Thank you to each of our esteemed panelists. We're honored by your participation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.